2 hours, the presenters on every news channel were saying injured but expected to make a full recovery, and I have no idea why, but it made me so angry.
For years, the inner circle of Diana remained mostly quiet as global media outlets constantly drew parallels between Meghan Markle and the late Princess of Wales. Assertions that Meghan's essence and behavior mirrored my mother so closely filled the airwaves. However, that prolonged reticence has reportedly shattered now, sending immense shockwaves through royal commentators across the globe. What the sister of Diana has allegedly brought to light has reignited intense debates regarding family loyalty, heritage, and the boundaries that ought to remain uncrossed. Both defenders and detractors are rapidly taking positions, yet the entire account is still shrouded in deep controversy. Did Prince Harry misjudge a quiet presence he assumed would never utter a word? What is your perspective on this? Was the sister of Diana justified in voicing her thoughts, or should domestic matters remain strictly confidential? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. Remember to hit like and follow along for subsequent royal updates. Whispers from the closest confidants of Diana. For decades, a singular individual stayed almost entirely detached from the public disputes that continuously flared up around the memory of Princess Diana. While television specials debuted, explosive interviews triggered public outcries, and unending comparisons lined the pages of newspapers and dominated broadcast panels, the sister of Diana, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, stayed firmly outside the fray. In sharp contrast to many who had ties to one of the most celebrated figures of the modern era, she earned a reputation for intentionally avoiding the spotlight. That quietude turned into a defining characteristic. It was by no means a brief phase, it persisted across transforming royal eras, evolving public sentiments, and a multitude of occasions where others would have eagerly grabbed the microphone. This is precisely why recent assertions indicating that Sarah has ultimately offered her perspective on the unending debates regarding Meghan Markle have captured such profound attention. Royal analysts immediately detected an extraordinary shift. This was not an attempt by a prominent figure to capture headlines, nor was it a commentator offering an analytical viewpoint from the sidelines. This was an individual who shared Diana's life long before television crews materialized, long before the demands of royalty altered their existence, and long before global adoration transformed her sister into a worldwide symbol. The specific timing of this development only intensified the fascination. For a prolonged period, comparisons involving Meghan and Diana have been central to public discourse. Meghan would instantly recognize the significance as she sat on the carpet in that specific attire, her legs crossed in that exact manner, sporting a white button-down. She would have been fully aware of the precise moment she was replicating. Advocates frequently highlight the overlapping nature of their trials within the monarchy, whereas skeptics maintain that such juxtapositions trivialize two vastly separate life stories. Nonetheless, this thematic link has persisted as one of the most enduring elements of the public narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan. Throughout all these discussions, Sarah maintained her quiet posture. That very restraint produced a layer of mystique, because when an individual deliberately chooses to withhold comment for years, observers inevitably ponder their genuine thoughts. The lack of an overt stance can echo just as loudly as an explicit proclamation. For Sarah, each passing year without public commentary seemed to solidify the impression that she valued her seclusion far above public engagement. Then, out of nowhere, the focus shifted entirely. Whispers began to surface that the sister of Diana was no longer content to merely watch from the wings while arguments concerning Meghan, Harry, and the enduring memory of Diana grew more volatile. Whether this intervention stems from deep anxiety, irritation, or an innate wish to inject clarity, her alleged step forward instantly recast the entire situation. Queries multiplied almost overnight. What triggered this sudden departure? Why choose this specific moment? And above all, what reality finally persuaded a deeply private individual that keeping quiet was no longer a viable path? Within the corridors of royalty, intrigue escalated at a rapid pace. Sarah has never been one for theatrical public pronouncements, which gave this unfolding scenario an even heavier sense of importance. Her lifelong bond with Diana gives her stance an unparalleled authority that very few people can replicate. She was not someone analyzing events from afar, she was an integral part of Diana's formative years, long before the public ever uttered her name. As rumors continued to ripple outward, an undeniable reality emerged. When someone who has spent decades steering clear of public friction finally shows a willingness to step into a highly sensitive dispute, observers naturally deduce that a monumental shift has occurred. Whether that deduction holds true remains to be seen, but Sarah's reported choice to cast aside decades of reserve has injected a completely fresh element into a narrative already weighed down by speculation. The ultimate fallout from that transition may just be starting to surface. After decades of remaining tight-lipped, a figure long obscured from public observation begins to step out from the royal shadows, prompting critical questions. What ultimate factor compelled her to speak up at this time? What reality has been kept hidden for all these years? And who is bound to face exposure this time around? Keep watching. Kinship connections. Harry never harbored a single doubt. Well before public feuds, televised sit-downs, and relentless media headlines turned the royal narrative into an international spectacle, Prince Harry felt a deep bond with a branch of his family that held a profoundly sacred meaning. The Spencer lineage was far more than a mere chapter in his mother's background, they were woven directly into his own life. Following the tragic passing of Princess Diana in 1997, those familial bridges grew even more vital. During the most agonizing chapters of his youth, Harry stayed tightly aligned with the aunts and uncles who remembered Diana not as a global royal figure, but as a young daughter, a sister, and a cherished relative. That mutual heartbreak forged connections that seemed incredibly resilient, lasting, and nearly impossible to untangle. For a long time, external commentators took it for granted that those bonds remained perfectly intact. The Spencers stood as a living bridge to the world of Diana, and Harry consistently seemed to treasure that relationship. From an outside viewpoint, it felt entirely logical to assume that the family of Diana would comprehend his choices far better than anyone else on Earth. They endured the exact same devastation, after all. They preserved the identical recollections, and they understood the deeply human side of Diana that the broader world never truly witnessed. That foundational assumption may have transformed into one of the most critical elements of the narrative currently playing out. As arguments regarding Meghan Markle, the duties of royalty, and the heritage of Diana escalated in intensity, the spotlight regularly landed on the chasm between Harry and the royal palace. Considerably less focus was directed toward how Diana's own blood relatives perceived these tectonic shifts. For an extended duration, their lack of public statements provided ample room for conjecture. Lacking official proclamations, the public simply formed their own conclusions. Some inferred that the family of Diana automatically endorsed the path Harry chose, while others took it for granted that they shared his internal irritations behind the scenes. However, assumptions should never be mistaken for verified realities, and keeping quiet can frequently paint an entirely distorted picture. The mere prospect that Lady Sarah McCorquodale might interpret specific occurrences through a completely different lens instantly upends that framework. Her reported actions introduce a deeply uncomfortable inquiry that few observers seemed willing to voice. What if the individuals tied directly to Diana do not perceive recent developments in a uniform manner? What if showing allegiance to Harry and protecting the legacy of Diana lead down entirely divergent paths? That specific scenario carries an extraordinary weight because rebuffs from random strangers can be easily brushed aside. Dismissing criticism that originates from within one's own family is a fundamentally different challenge. It stems from individuals who possess a shared history, lived encounters, and deep-seated psychological ties that external parties simply can never grasp. When apprehensions emerge from that internal circle, they are inevitably viewed through an entirely different prism. They feel immensely more personal, harder to overlook, and far more intricate to rationalize away. Certain analysts suspect that Harry might have anticipated unconditional empathy from the relatives of Diana, no matter the context. Conversely, others maintain there is zero proof he ever believed such backing was set in stone. That very ambiguity is what makes this entire situation so deeply fascinating. The public remains entirely unaware of the actual dialogues that transpired behind closed doors, or how various family members truly felt as the years marched on. What is turning into an undeniable reality, however, is that the entire story is far more intricate than many initially presumed. If the sister of Diana is truly stepping forward after decades of holding back, her unique viewpoint has the capacity to fundamentally upend expectations that have stood for an incredibly long time. And should those initial assumptions prove false, Harry could find himself facing a situation he never envisioned, that even within the maternal family of Diana, total harmony was never as guaranteed as it appeared on the surface. How could someone who grew up so close to the family of Diana misread their quietness as absolute validation? What truly unfolded away from public view? Who was the first to openly question the assumptions Harry held? And what kind of fallout will occur when long-held allegiances are finally pushed to their absolute limits in ways no one ever foresaw? Stay glued. Parallels that completely refuse to disappear. By the moment the reported perspective of Lady Sarah McCorquodale began generating widespread interest, a specific issue had already become utterly impossible to disentangle from the grander narrative. This was not about an isolated television appearance, a localized domestic dispute, or a singular public engagement by the monarchy. It was the unrelenting comparison that had trailed Meghan Markle for a span of multiple years. Time and again, public discourse gravitated back to the exact same premise: was Meghan enduring a contemporary replication of what Princess Diana once went through? This juxtaposition materialized in editorial pieces, broadcast arguments, multi-part documentaries, digital media threads, and endless dialogues among royal enthusiasts globally. Over the course of time, it solidified into one of the most dominant and polarizing storylines defining the public existence of Meghan. The profound intrigue surrounding this comparison was entirely understandable. Both individuals entered one of the most fiercely analyzed households on the planet. Both became the focal points of staggering media scrutiny. Both encountered an intense level of public fascination that stretched far beyond the parameters of typical celebrity interest. To a multitude of advocates, those commonalities appeared glaringly obvious. They analyzed the tribulations of Meghan entirely through the framework of the life of Diana, identifying structural patterns they felt could not be cast aside. Yet, a different camp viewed those exact same comparisons through a totally separate lens. As the years ticked by, detractors increasingly questioned whether these commonalities were being inflated to an unrealistic degree. They asserted that while certain trials might look identical on the surface level, the underlying details, the specific historical eras, and the personal dynamics remained fundamentally distinct. What one group identified as a deeply meaningful parallel, another group perceived as a crude oversimplification of two highly intricate human lives. The ongoing argument progressively moved past a simple examination of facts, entering a territory of pure perception where finding common ground became exceptionally difficult. This is the precise junction where the alleged involvement of the sister of Diana takes on an extraordinary level of significance. Unlike media commentators, reporters, or seasoned royal historians, Sarah commands an entirely unique vantage point in this entire discussion. She was intimately acquainted with Diana long before any royal titles were granted, well before the palace walls enclosed her, and prior to the unrelenting global spotlight that turned her into an international icon recognized across every continent. That deep personal history gives her viewpoint a totally different caliber of authority. Whether people find themselves in alignment with her perspective or not, her foundational bond with Diana cannot simply be disregarded. For certain commentators, this explains why the constant comparisons have reportedly triggered a sense of deep unease within specific branches of the family of Diana. The core problem is not necessarily whether Meghan and Diana crossed paths with identical hurdles. The far more sensitive issue is whether having shared hurdles automatically warrants placing both individuals inside the exact same historical narrative. Striking similarities and absolute equivalence are by no means identical concepts, yet public commentary regularly glues the two together. That persistent ambiguity has settled into the absolute center of this controversy. Defending voices of the comparison claim that the life journey of Diana provides crucial context for comprehending the path Meghan has taken. On the flip side, critics argue that constantly framing Meghan through the history of Diana runs the risk of flattening both women into basic caricatures of their true selves. Sandwiched between those two perspectives lies an expanding territory of friction that remains entirely unaddressed. The more oxygen this comparison receives, the more emotionally explosive it turns. Every single fresh argument seems to entrench existing battle lines rather than offering any resolution. And because Diana continues to hold such a monumental space in the collective memory, any dialogue that touches upon her legacy inherently bears an immense emotional gravity. What makes this dynamic even more fascinating is the reality that a universally agreed upon conclusion may not even exist. The comparison endures precisely because different observers evaluate the exact same series of events through completely mismatched prisms. Yet, if the sister of Diana has indeed grown worried enough to step into this ongoing dialogue, it indicates that the argument has escalated to a threshold where staying quiet no longer feels like a neutral stance, and that very realization is beginning to completely transform the entire narrative. Why does the parallel between Meghan and Diana persistently refuse to fade away? Who stands to gain by keeping this storyline alive? What hidden animosities does it trigger deep within the royal household? And how deep does this discomfort truly run before the entire landscape shifts? Let's find out. The intimate domain of Diana that very few ever saw. Long before Princess Diana transformed into one of the most universally recognized figures on the globe, she was simply Diana within the quiet confines of the Spencer home. Well before grand palace events, screaming newspaper headlines, and international focus altered her world completely, she lived in a private space known solely to those who stood nearest to her. It was an environment defined by small family gatherings, quiet face-to-face dialogues, ordinary daily routines, and personal bonds completely untouched by the immense burdens that would subsequently dictate her public persona. Very few individuals observed that unvarnished version of Diana more intimately than her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale. That core reality is precisely what renders the viewpoint of Sarah so profoundly critical in the present day. While millions of individuals formulated their views on Diana by analyzing snapshots, broadcast interviews, and orchestrated appearances, Sarah was entirely familiar with her before any of those elements ever materialized. She was well acquainted with the young woman existing behind the media frenzy. She knew the sister and family member rather than the international monument. That particular divide is vital, because the collective memory frequently holds on to merely a fraction of an individual's life story, whereas intimate personal recollections can unveil a completely contradictory portrait. As the years advanced, Diana was transformed into an emblem for a multitude of separate causes, human sentiments, and cultural storylines. Supporters lauded her empathy, critics picked apart her personal dilemmas, and historians dissected her ultimate reach. Yet, as her public image grew larger than life, some of the more understated facets of her true character became increasingly obscured. The more iconic she became, the simpler it turned for observers to lock their focus onto the grand myth rather than the actual human being. Those who existed closest to her, however, held on to recollections that operated entirely outside the boundaries of public imagination. Blood relatives remembered distinct chapters that never found their way into television documentaries or front-page exposes. They retained memories of personal attributes that lenses could never fully pin down. The genuine warmth, vulnerability, wit, and psychological depth of Diana were encountered firsthand by the people who shared her formative years. These were by no means strategically crafted public expressions, they were raw, daily encounters forged long before royal codes and obligations ever entered the frame. This specific upbringing helps illuminate why the non-stop comparisons involving Diana can feel so intensely personal for certain members of her maternal family. Public debates regularly home in on sweeping conceptual themes and highly visible milestones. Family members, conversely, frequently process those identical dialogues strictly through the lens of individual memory. They are not merely juxtaposing two public personas against each other, they are matching those media images against a living, breathing person they actually loved and knew. For Sarah, that profound distinction could hold an immense amount of weight. As arguments concerning Meghan Markle and the ultimate legacy of Diana march onward, the comprehension Sarah has of Diana remains anchored in decades of shared personal history. Her viewpoint was never crafted by television specials, talk show panels, or public narratives constructed long after Diana passed away. It was forged by actual, lived experience. That reality does not automatically guarantee her personal evaluation is flawless, but it ensures it is uniquely informed. The core friction stems from the sheer potency of memory itself. It dictates how people decipher unfolding events in the present and how they judge associations involving days gone by. What looks entirely logical to an outside observer might appear completely distorted to an individual who possesses an intimate, insider knowledge that the general public can never access. That specific chasm between media perception and private recollection regularly breeds deep misunderstandings, particularly when analyzing personalities as monumentally famous as Diana. As the spotlight shifts more intensely toward the reported stances of Sarah, the dialogue expands into something far greater than Meghan Markle alone. It transforms into a battle over who possesses the fundamental right to outline the life history of Diana, and whose perspective commands the ultimate authority. While the public continues its endless debate over commonalities, contrasts, and historical legacy, the recollections of Sarah bring forward an element that cannot be easily disputed or duplicated: a genuine, first-hand grasp of the woman behind the massive legend. And that reality may turn out to be increasingly vital as the broader narrative continues to take shape. How much of the genuine self of Diana was masked behind the image the public assumed it understood completely? What specific recollections has Sarah kept hidden away for all this time? Why are they coming to light at this exact moment? And could these fresh revelations alter every single thing we thought we knew about the life of Diana before she ever entered royalty? Stay with us. Allegiances pulled in completely opposite directions. As the whirlwind of attention surrounding Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the enduring heritage of Princess Diana intensified, the ongoing conversation gradually evolved into something far larger than any solitary person. What initially seemed to be a basic argument over media comparisons and domestic viewpoints began morphing into a much more labyrinthine dilemma. Beneath the glaring news headlines, a far quieter, more profound inquiry was taking shape. How were the blood relatives of Diana actually interpreting the chaotic events unfolding right before their eyes? The ultimate answer was far less simple than a multitude of outside analysts took for granted. For an extended period, public commentary regularly treated the family of Diana as a single, harmonious voice. Because they all shared an identical blood tie to her, a large portion of the public naturally assumed they processed contemporary scandals through a highly synchronized lens. Yet, family units almost never function with absolute, flawless agreement, particularly when raw human emotions, deep histories, and sensitive personal recollections are tangled up in the mix. The relentless march of time might bond relatives together through mutual historical experiences, but it can simultaneously cultivate profoundly mismatched interpretations of those very same experiences. That undeniable reality appears more and more pertinent as the global scrutiny surrounding Harry and Meghan shows no signs of slowing down. At the absolute epicenter of this dynamic sits an incredibly challenging balancing act between showing outward loyalty and honoring internal convictions. Standard familial backing does not automatically mean endorsing every single path taken. By the exact same token, voicing a deep sense of worry does not inherently mean total banishment or malice. Those crucial nuances are regularly obliterated in loud public arenas where the audience constantly demands that individuals pick an absolute side. Inside actual families, however, feelings are normally far more entangled than basic concepts of absolute allegiance or total defiance. For the blood relatives of Diana, navigating that exact maze may be uniquely tortuous. On one side of the equation stands Harry, a son who navigated the devastating loss of his mother under deeply traumatic, global circumstances and has voiced with complete vulnerability the profound mark that trauma left on his psyche. On the opposite side of the equation stands the very memory of Diana herself, a figure whose ultimate historical footprint bears a sacred emotional value for the people who loved her in real life. When public dialogues begin fusing those two separate realities into a single entity, painful questions inevitably crop up. The entire situation grows even more volatile because the ongoing rifts within the monarchy show absolutely zero indication of fading away. Years after Harry and Meghan officially stepped away from their institutional responsibilities, their ongoing disagreements continue to fuel front-page headlines across multiple continents. Every fresh interview, multi-part documentary, public appearance, or rumored dispute seems to throw gasoline onto existing sparks. What might have once looked like a passing phase now carries the weight of a permanent, long-running war with no clear exit strategy in sight. That relentless endurance appears to be fostering a state of mounting anxiety among various close observers. This specific worry is not necessarily pinned to a single public statement or an isolated event. Rather, it focuses heavily on the grander historical narrative taking shape around the legacy of Diana. As comparisons persist and competing interpretations gain serious traction, certain family members may harbor a deep fear that the life story of Diana is being systematically dragged into contemporary feuds, leaving her completely unable to speak for herself or protect her own image. Naturally, alternative voices might argue the exact opposite. They may firmly believe that the lived encounters of Diana remain profoundly relevant to this day, and that openly analyzing them offers an essential framework for comprehending current event structures. That specific viewpoint remains an active component of the broader argument and helps clarify why viewpoints diverge so drastically. The core problem is that both opposing factions frequently claim to be shielding the exact same historical legacy, all while arriving at completely backward conclusions regarding what that shielding should actually look like. As reported, insights from prominent individuals like Lady Sarah McCorquodale draw a mounting level of global focus. The underlying stakes keep climbing higher. What once appeared to be an isolated friction involving only Harry, Meghan, and the immediate palace walls now looks intricately tied to a much vaster network of blood relatives, deeply held memories, and clashing moral duties. The deeper this conversation travels, the more transparent it becomes that this is no longer a mere battle over public optics. It is transforming into a profound war over who commands the true authority to define the life history of Diana. And that specific war is only growing more convoluted as time marches on. Separate branches of the maternal family of Diana are beginning to view the escalating friction in radically clashing ways as private sentiments slammed directly into public expectations. Who is quietly steering this storyline behind closed doors? What structural fractures are on the verge of splintering open when true allegiance is pushed to its absolute limit? Let's unravel the mystery. The exact juncture where keeping quiet became an absolute impossibility. For a long span of years, Lady Sarah McCorquodale managed to keep herself entirely clear of the escalating storms that swirled around Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the historical memory of Princess Diana. While media headlines grew increasingly hostile, television documentaries debuted, and public arguments stretched across broadcast news and digital networking platforms, Sarah stayed almost entirely absent from the grand theater. Her quiet posture was unswerving, highly intentional, and remarkably uncommon in a saga that seemed to draw hot takes from nearly every single individual possessing even a remote tie to it. Yet, the specific puzzle currently capturing widespread attention is by no means why she maintained that quiet posture for such an extended period. Rather, it is the question of what ultimate factor finally convinced her that keeping quiet was no longer a sustainable option. The true explanation appears to rest within a sequence of escalating developments that progressively shifted a running public dialogue into something far too massive to simply turn a blind eye to. None of these specific shifts materialized overnight. On the contrary, they gathered weight over an extended timeline, piling layer upon layer of friction until the overarching conversation began to take on a fundamentally different, more aggressive tone. What originally kicked off as localized friction regarding Harry and Meghan exiting their institutional royal roles eventually ballooned into much vaster inquiries involving the literal memory of Diana, her historical footprint, and the precise manner in which her life story was continuously weaponized in contemporary public battles. One dominant, recurring motif rose far above all others: the constant comparisons drawn between Meghan and Diana simply refused to die down. In reality, they seemed to gain frequency as global curiosity expanded. Every single fresh scandal, every televised sit-down, and every major tactical shift seemed to breathe new life into that specific argument. Protecting voices highlighted clear overlaps in press treatment and relentless public exposure. Meanwhile, critics countered that such juxtapositions drastically oversimplified two fundamentally distinct lifelines. As those clashing interpretations smashed into each other time and again, the entire debate turned increasingly volatile and emotional. For an individual in Sarah's unique shoes, that unfolding scenario likely carried an unparalleled emotional weight. Unlike media pundits tracking the fallout from a safe distance, she held tight to a bank of intimate, private recollections of Diana that completely predated any public media narrative. The specific version of Diana she loved was never an international emblem or a catchy news headline; she was a flesh and blood sister. Consequently, the non-stop public processing of the life of Diana likely felt completely different from the way it appeared to standard onlookers. Simultaneously, the deep-seated friction surrounding the standing of Harry with both the royal household and the court of public opinion showed absolutely zero signs of cooling down. Years after the primary institutional fractures first burst into view, fresh scandals continued to see center stage. Instead of softening with the passage of time, the existing divides regularly appeared to grow even deeper. Every fresh milestone prompted renewed arguments regarding family loyalty, moral duty, and the long-range fallout of the paths chosen by all involved factions. This specific cluster of elements may have ultimately engineered what multiple royal analysts categorize as a definitive tipping point. This was by no means an isolated, theatrical incident, but rather a slow accumulation of friction. It was not an abrupt shock to the system, but a creeping realization that the broader dialogue was migrating in a direction that could no longer be met with passive silence. The true significance rests not merely on the substance of what was being analyzed, but on the sheer frequency with which the actual name of Diana kept surfacing at the absolute center of those explosive discussions. Naturally, individual interpretations vary wildly. There are those who believe that the reported actions of Sarah mirror a deep-seated anxiety regarding how the historical legacy of Diana is being actively utilized. Conversely, alternative voices assert she may simply desire to inject a dose of grounded perspective into an argument that has turned dangerously polarized. Lacking a direct window into her internal psychological motives, achieving absolute certainty remains completely out of reach. What is glaringly obvious, however, is that a major shift has transpired. A figure legendary for decades of intense personal restraint now appears linked to a wider conversation she once spent her life dodging. That single transition indicates that this entire saga has crossed the threshold into a totally fresh phase. If maintaining a quiet posture was once looked upon as the most secure route, recent events may have ultimately forced Sarah to conclude that staying silent bore its own dangerous set of hazards, and that realization could turn out to be vastly more consequential than anyone ever assumed at the start. Why did Sarah ultimately select this specific window of time? What hidden pressures forced her past her absolute breaking point of silence? Was it the most recent public media explosion, the never-ending comparisons to Diana, or something far more intimate festering away behind closed doors? And what happens to the status quo once the raw truth begins to leak out into the open? Whispers echoed behind securely closed palace entryways. Within the serene environments situated far away from flashing media lenses, the running dialogue surrounding Harry, Meghan Markle, and the ultimate historical footprint of Princess Diana began drifting into a deeply confidential and vastly more intricate territory. While the public realm remained completely locked on visible pronouncements, explosive interviews, and official royal analysis, there were reportedly much quieter, highly sensitive deliberations occurring within the immediate family circles that never once leaked into the view of the general populace. These specific dialogues were by no means characterized as hostile showdowns, rather, they were framed as highly calculated, careful efforts to dissect how these running animosities might permanently impact personal bonds, public reputations, and the long-range preservation of the overarching family history. According to verified insider reports, individuals within the wider ancestral circle of Diana, prominently including Lady Sarah McCorquodale, were growing increasingly conscious of a core reality: keeping quiet in front of the press did not equal absolute silence behind closed doors. As the explosive debates regarding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry continued to bounce across the global media landscape, the internal psychological pressure to address the situation from within appeared to mount significantly, even pulling in those individuals who had historically gone to great lengths to avoid any form of involvement. Deep within these highly confidential huddles, the core anxiety was reportedly less focused on short-term public approval metrics and far more centered on how those external perspectives were permanently sculpting the long-range historical understanding of Princess Diana's legacy. Certain family members are said to have voiced intense worry that the unending comparisons drawn between Diana and Meghan Markle were progressively beginning to muddy the waters, erasing critical lines of distinction that had always remained perfectly sharp and clear within the household itself. On the other hand, alternative family voices maintained that the public discourse had simply exploded far past anyone's realistic capacity to regulate or steer, particularly when taking into account the sheer, staggering magnitude of global attention constantly fixed on both women. What rendered this internal dynamic exceptionally fragile was the universal understanding that any hint of a comment originating from within the blood family of Diana could instantly be weaponized, morphing into a massive centerpiece for a much larger media firestorm. Even the individuals who preferred to stay entirely out of sight appeared to fully grasp that their very choice to stay quiet was being decoded in a dozen different ways by external analysts. Increasingly, the core dilemma extended far past the individual actions of Meghan Markle or Prince Harry. It centered heavily on how the literal memory of Diana was being continuously tapped as a convenient benchmark in running contemporary feuds. As these quiet deliberations dragged onward away from public view, a creeping realization took root that the family was actively steering through not only intense external observation, but also internal friction regarding the most appropriate way to handle the fallout. This surfacing divide did not manifest as an aggressive, open war, but manifested instead as highly understated variations in personal interpretation, overall tone, and moral responsibility. Yet, even the most understated variations carried a massive structural weight, because they anchored themselves directly to the ultimate historical legacy of Princess Diana and the precise manner in which it ought to be preserved in the contemporary era. To multiple outside analysts, this creeping internal friction strongly indicated that the long-standing storyline surrounding the family of Diana was no longer a perfectly unified front, but had instead turned quietly fragmented across clashing viewpoints. The longer these confidential discussions remained completely shielded from the public eye, the more